Thank you very much for indulging me on that last one, going on the magic carpet ride with me. I know I'm a little bit like a dog chasing cars. If I may extend into another analogy, I am going to tie the rope around my waist while you go way down the rabbit hole, and I'll just be up here if you need me. I love the specificity of what we're about to get into, and I think a very specific aspect of this podcast that I'm very proud of is how much we love heavy music. Like that's where we overlap the most tightly as friends and music fans. Right. How to goth. But you are, to quote Community, streets ahead of me on this thing and are constantly teaching me stuff. And what we're about to get into, I think, is so cool. Like, if I were trying to explain to someone who you are, and like the quickest way to your heart and unlocking friendship with you, this weird little thing is kind of it. So I think this was one of the first ideas for a TuneDig radio episode that we had.
Yeah, you said, what if we did prompts instead of an album? And I went, what if we did one for HM-2? Yeah.
I think it went even earlier than that, where it was like, I want to do like Trap Them, but I don't necessarily want to devote a whole episode to it. You know, if we do like a Converge and some other heavy stuff, some of it gets to be repetitive. Like, OMG, I love Kurt Ballou. So this was a good like side door entree into that. So Cliff, tell us about the Heavy Metal 2 Petal and what we can expect from this episode, especially for someone who may not consider themselves a fan of heavy music.
I would love to. So today we're going to be...
It's like the prompt that you always wish you got at a bar, you very specifically, and now it's here. Now that we can't go to bars, here it is with a harsh light on us.
It's like the TV episodes that ends in a debate competition, and you get your last prompt and you're like, yes!
Did I just black out? I have no idea what I just said.
Yeah, so today I'll be talking to you about the 4 knobs that changed heavy music, and I'm not talking about Metallica. Thanks.
Tell me you woke up in the middle of the night and had that exact thought. And you're like, well, I know how we're dropping into the half pipe of this episode.
I pulled over to the side of the road when I got it, yeah. So, like, this will be great not only to be dorky, but because it's such a good going all the way down into some really specific thread to tie all these things together that you'd never know about unless you cared about all the layer of details to get to it. Not just like production in general, but like I'm a person who emailed Kurt Ballou once and was like, how do I do this thing that I hear? Like, I know that I won't be able to act on your answer, and I still just want to know, will you tell me? And he did, which was awesome. But so this one particular guitar pedal was honestly like a piece of shit, is like the story of this pedal. It was first produced in Japan in the mid 80s from 83 to 88. And then they swapped it over to Taiwan. And this is how you know it's an interesting musical thing, right? They moved from manufacturing it in Japan to manufacturing it in Taiwan. Changed nothing about any of it, but everyone wants the Japanese one because it sounds better. Even though you can easily find videos on YouTube with people who are being like, no, definitely not. These are the same things. Still, it's got all this culture to it. And it's such a great example of like music memeing, like introducing entirely new subgenres. And like metal is already a genre that splinters into a million meme-based genres anyway. Like, we will briefly touch on like some of the branches of metal that go into like gore and violence and stuff. But like even that itself is just a meme, and all violence and gore in that branch of metal anyway is just out memeing the last person to meme this thing because for funsies, basically. So we take this garbage guitar pedal that was that was marketed by Boss towards people who wanted to emulate the Marshall stack sound of hair metal bands. And it did such a garbage job.
In the first half, I'm not gonna lie.
It did such a garbage job.
But I love that it was like, take the great thing from the worst example of it that we could possibly use. Not the Marshall sound of Jimmy Page,
right?
But the Marshall sound of Rat.
Right. So I mean, and just to give an idea of it, because we could go super deep on the science, and by God, I'm going to spare everybody that. But like, just to give an example, like there are 4 knobs on this thing, right? And one of them is a distortion knob. Like verifiably, between the numbers 3 and 8, nothing changes in the pedal. 100% verified. The knob doesn't even work appropriately. And so it's got these weird little things that you would now call a nuance, but back then was just a broken, crappy pedal that no one wanted. As with all forms of anything like this in music, it comes from not only a pure accident and a terrible marketing ploy, but also, do you know who popularized this pedal to begin with?
I only just found out, and I'm very excited for you to share.
David Gilmour from Pink Floyd.
In the mid-'80s, with the weirdest sounding album, like when those 70s dudes started leaning into 80s sounds, it was all weird.
Yeah.
You know, like Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel and everything like that from the mid to late 70s. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant are also good examples. Like when I read that in an overview of the HM-2, I was like, no. What could David Gilmour doing something Entombed made popular? Like, what could that even sound like? And then you hear it and you're like, oh, I get it. I don't like it, but I get it. He did it on his solo record and then the one Floyd record from the late 80s.
Yeah, About Face and A Momentary Lapse of Reason.
Right.
Yeah. But like, it's a good example too of some people continue to use it essentially as like a boost pedal. Mm-hmm. So you tweak with all the knobs that make for the terrible garbage sound.
I did love though that he said specifically, I had a fuzz or a distortion, but I didn't like some of the ruder edges of that, and this actually tamped that down. Yeah. But then the way it got popular to be used was like the opposite of that. It was like, I want all the ugliness from this thing. So that was really interesting. I love the story of this for me is like the creativity that comes from deliberate misuse or like anti-something. So I know we'll get into that.
Yeah. And so this pedal existed naturally. You know, I don't know if David Gilmour was paid or not to advocate for it, but I mean, especially in the 80s, like that's when guitar companies ramped up. Guitar magazines with full page ads, with sponsored players, with like signature guitar, signature amp, signature pedal, right? So everybody could push everything. Like, you know, Van Halen was pushing the EVH stuff. Like, so it was just like full on, like the economy is going up. Kids have money. Like they're watching MTV now. They want to emulate stuff. And so you got a bunch of this stuff. And so, like, as with a lot of things that came out in the 80s, there's really no sense of quality one way or another from all the stuff that was being produced. But what happened was...
until this decade, I would have said the 80s were the worst decade ever, but I don't know. We're giving it a run.
Yeah, we're going to give it a run for its money on the first year of the decade.
Because we had shitty actor presidents and all that. Let's not. We've done that already. That's in the past. Let's talk about heavy metal. Let's bang our heads.
Yeah, let's send messages to our future selves.
I really wish that we had gotten like a 6-pack of PBR tall boys and just crushed them and gotten them all in the carpet here. Because like I miss that vibe. We haven't done live music in a very long time, and I'm barefoot, and I just want cigarette smoke smell all in this room.
Nothing smells bad anymore, and I miss it. Yeah. Oh, man.
Just stop showering at your house. That's all you got to do.
I've tried. I can't get there. So like with a lot of classic, like someone figured out some weird angle of music, like honestly a lot like sampling in the sense of finding a weird version of something and then creating something totally new out of it. The whole HM-2 resurgence basically just came out of just dead poor Swedish kids who were able to get a hold of these pedals because Boss is making a ton of them, right? 1 and 2, they're not popular, so no one really wants them. So you can get a hold of them, right? And there's plenty of story to be told about cheap solid state PV amps and all this stuff for a lot of the black and death metal that came out of late 80s and early 90s, especially in the Nordic area. But so there was a band called Nihilist. The bassist of Nihilist becomes a guitarist in what would eventually become the band known as Atheist. And so he's playing guitar, which, switching between bass and guitar was, a thing that didn't matter at that point because everything sounds like garbage in this entire genre of music on purpose and for fun. So
a joke that I still don't understand the punchline of, by the way.
There is no punchline. That's what's awesome about it. There's no point. There's no funny. It's not satire. That's zero funny. So
it's an extremely European sensibility.
Yeah, that's. I feel a lot of camaraderie with it.
The joke is that you are the joke.
The joke is you think a joke exists.
Like your god.
So inevitably what happens, and I can say this as somebody who's spent 15 years trying to understand guitar stuff. When you don't actually know what you're doing and you don't have the energy to figure out how to do it correctly, you just start jacking around with knobs until you get something funny. So
that's what she said.
Oh boy. So thank you, Kyle.
I'll try to stay off that track for this one.
Thanks. That's what she asked. So turn all the knobs to 10 on this pedal.
Dime 'em.
I mean,
which is such a cool phrase. It's like say it and flick a cigarette.
So
in
good.
The studio. Dime 'em all.
But because of the way that this pedal is built, it sounds so different from every other combination of the knobs that it creates this other sound that it was definitely not supposed to be making at that point, right? So then you're taking this HM-2 cheap pedal with a cheap guitar piped through a cheap solid state PV amp, and all of a sudden you've got this thing that sounds like the subwoofer's being ripped off of whatever cabinet it's in. It doesn't sound right at all, and that meant it was perfect for what they needed. So it did something totally different. They started using it for its abrasive properties, and it became known as the Swedish sound, essentially, for a lot of this music. But I think the thing that we want to now, double down on is it wasn't just nothing matters, my guitar tone doesn't matter. Actually, they started figuring out the tone that this pedal is producing actually leaves a really different kind of sonic register and palette in the music itself, to where you can hear different things now in a way that, especially metal from that time period, I mean, it was all just slammed into the mid-range. And it sounded super muddy. And ironically, this pedal, because it was overly distorting everything, actually kind of emptied out that space a little bit and left some room for articulation. Again, it sounds like a joke, but it ended up leaving room for articulation in a way that made metal actually more bearable. You could hear some of the parts.
And if you talk about it in terms of sonics, it the sound of this pedal is indescribable when it's true. To call it the chainsaw pedal doesn't really go all the way there. It's interesting that the sonic signature pushes out the mids, because it's the mid of the high is where you get the buzz, and the mid of the low is where you get the chuggy part. Mm-hmm. And I know we'll talk about this later, but this first block of songs I love because it prefaces it in the right way. It doesn't sound all the way right until you put all the right dressings around it.
Yeah.
Right. And it was the third or fourth song, I think it was the Carnage song, where there's incredible low end for the first time.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I get it now. Because you start with this Mayhem song, and it's almost like white balancing for your ears with this thing.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't love the sound of this necessarily. This is that black metal shit that he's always trying to get me to listen to. But it's such a perfect setup, so I'm really grateful that you did it this way.
Yeah.
Because when you get into the stuff that actually starts sounding objectively good, you're like, oh my god! I mean, it hits you like nothing else can.
Yeah. So in this first block, like you've said, we touch on the early '90s for the most part, but I wanted to like back up just before people started figuring out the 4-dime setup of this pedal so that you can hear the progression of it. And I've tried to organize this playlist. It's not perfect, but I've tried to organize it in a way where you can really feel like almost like a curve, the way that it starts being produced. It's almost like you start to notice it in the mix. And then over time, song after song, you realize people are actually producing around this guitar tone. Right. It becomes a consequential part of the entire mix on purpose later, and then would, as we'll cover in a bit, would spiderweb out into very intentionally creating nuanced versions of this otherwise very unnuanced sound, which is rad. So kicking off with Life Eternal from Mayhem, even though it came out in '94, which is a little bit after some of the kind of canonical Swedish buzzsaw stuff started happening, I wanted to bring it out because Euronymous played in this band before. So this was like right before he was very famously murdered, which is, again, a very black metal thing to talk about. But this was sort of before the culture had totally absorbed itself in this is the only way to use this pedal. And so what was funny is the way Euronymous used it in Mayhem in this song is like the only other way that this pedal is ever used, which is in combination with another overdrive pedal. So he was using an SD1, but I've seen people use a DS1 and other things like that. So where you don't dime everything on the HM-2, but you're either using it as like a boost after an overdrive or a boost into one. And it creates this just like ridiculous sound that then goes through like a really tiny crappy amp. But it's a great example of how black metal would actually play a little bit of a role in the way that this sound would kind of shape up, even though what it would come to be used for was pretty specifically death metal instead. And for anyone who's like, cool, black metal and death metal are going to be the main categories of this thing, I have no idea how to tell them apart. That's fine. Listen kind of closely to the first couple of songs. You'll start to hear the rhythm, for the most part, start to shift, and then the guitar riffs start to shift around the drums to where eventually death metal becomes, it's just groovier. It's got a kind of meaty riff to it, whereas black metal is content to just play really steady blast beats for 8 minutes and be done. But starting with the Mayhem song, like just after 3 minutes in, he kicks off into a riff that starts to show you how you could use this pedal to get some extra articulation out of the guitar, because it's been 3 minutes of muddy up until that point. And then you're starting to pick something out, but it's not just louder than everything else. It's the guitar and the bass playing the same riff, but it takes on like a totally different kind of attitude at that point in the song. And to me, it's just a good example, again, of like kids just tweaking around with how stuff works and stumbling upon something. So out of Mayhem, I also included the only Darkthrone record that actually included anything related to this particular tone. Darkthrone otherwise prides itself on being extremely pure black metal. But Grave with a View was part of this record that where they definitely borrowed the Swedish Chainsaw sound, produced the whole record that way, and it's very straight up buzzsaw, and then they never tried to do it again. But it was interesting because it was right there. It's like January '91, so it's like just after Left Hand Path is all coming out. So like it's a good example of like the moment of this weird little sound was so seismic in this little area of the world that even bands who prided themselves on not being like other bands tried it. Yeah. Because it was so immensely popular immediately. It started gaining a bunch of steam. So out of Darkthrone, then now we're lining back up with the traditional like Swedish Chainsaw path of things. So Dark Recollections from Carnage came out in January of '90, just before Left Hand Path, which is again like the canonical example of all this. But this Carnage record is what kicked off the producer at Sunlight Studios basically saying, oh, this is a thing. We're going to start doing this with bands because...
Amazing, by the way, that the studio for this was called Sunlight.
Right? There is no joke. Don't look for it. But... I think one good example from this song is, again, about 3 minutes in, there's a guitar solo, and it shows how in the Mayhem song, you start to get more articulation out of the guitar part. In the Carnage song, it shows you how, again, you can actually drop back and do the opposite with the same guitar tone, and you can put a solo on top of it, and there's room for everything without dropping volume or dynamics. And so it starts to move you in this direction of, like, if you're willing to listen to some pretty abrasive music really intentionally, you can start to hear how if someone listens to stuff like this every day for their whole life, everything becomes splitting hairs, right? And by this time, even just in early 90s, there's people going, oh, I can make room for this ridiculously played guitar solo in the midst of this ridiculously played guitar riff through this tiny amp, and I can leave room for articulation for it for the 17 people who will appreciate it at that time. So then the producer's picking it up at Sunlight Studio, and then now we're in classic Entombed land, and this is where pretty much anyone would bring you if we start talking about this pedal anyway. By
the way, if someone was like, to me, what is your favorite metal band? I don't know that it's the exact right answer based on data, but I always reach for Entombed first because they're the toughest and coolest metal band like that there ever was. And Left Hand Path and Wolverine Blues are still, like, they go harder than just about any. I would put it up against anything, man. Like, those records hit so fucking hard.
I can't believe that they existed at that time when nothing else before it was. And to me, whether that interests anybody or not, like, those moments to me are the things that fascinate me about music. Like, something gets in your blood and you're like, no, I want to sound like this forever, and I want other people to emulate it. And I think too,
it's more like the Johnny Cash thing. It's like, we'd play faster if we could.
Yeah.
It clicks with you at like a DNA level, and you're like, oh, this is my thing.
Yeah.
Now, yeah.
And so Entombed is using this. They're still going through, just like, this is an actual quote from the guitarist that recorded then. I used a worthless Ibanez guitar, a small PV combo amplifier, and a Boss HM-2 pedal. Basically, there are two Boss heavy metal distorted guitars, one in each speaker, and then a DS1 in the middle. So they're just like, they're using the HM-2, they're recording some different takes of guitar, and then they're just spreading it out across the speakers and trying to make a wall from nothing. And this initial Entombed record, the Left Hand Path, it gives you an example too of, like, there's some, in my opinion, there are some places even in this song Abnormally Deceased where they leave the sustain for just a minute and it drones just long enough, and to me it actually starts to sound like listening to Matt Pike live, where you're like, okay, everyone who cares about going to shows and listening to guitars, like, take a minute. Imagine and remember what it felt like to be in a room where the guitar player was turned up way too loud, okay? And you're there, and it's so much noise that it starts to distort in your own ears.
Yeah, crackles.
Yeah. And, like, it sort of represents the way that HM2 was able to push things in recording to that level without you having to turn up the volume itself. Like, it feels like the wheels are about to come off of the whole thing. And so, like, even the Entombed production on this record is a little bit more, like, tinny, almost more high-pitched when you compare it to, like, the Carnage song that came before it. But you can see producers trying to figure out what's the slight tweak that works for every band and every song. And so it's just such a good jumping off point. So, this is a 4-song kickoff to the whole playlist. Mayhem and Darkthrone were from Norway. Carnage and Entombed were from Sweden, both using HM2 in, like, totally brand new ways, effectively in the early 90s through black metal and death metal, respectively.